A former assistant of Sean Diddy Combs is revealing more about his time working for the now embattled mogul. Plus, he's giving more insight into what he knew about Diddy's alleged drug-fueled parties. I'm talking about Phil Pines, who worked as Diddy's senior executive assistant from 2019 through 2021. Now, Phil is kind of important. Obviously, as a personal assistant, you know lots about your high-powered boss, including things he may not have wanted in the public. But at this point, we have already learned so much about Diddy's alleged actions. And to have a boss who's already sitting behind bars charged with federal sex trafficking and more, it seems nothing is really off limits. Now, last month, Phil filed a lawsuit against his former boss, accusing Diddy of ordering him to coordinate, supplement, and even clean up these alleged drug fueled parties called Wild King Nights. So, what are Wild King Nights? Well, according to Phil, they are the same thing as the freak offs that were heavily detailed in Cassie's now settled lawsuit, as well as the federal government in their case against the mogul.
The indictment alleges that Combs abused and exploited women and other people for years, and in a variety of ways. As alleged, Combs used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sexual performances with male commercial sex workers, some of whom he transported or caused to be transported over state lines. Combs allegedly planned and controlled the sex performances, which he called freak-offs, and he often electronically recorded them. The freak-offs sometimes lasted days at a time, involved multiple commercial sex workers, and often involved a variety of narcotics, such as ketamine, ecstasy, and GHB.
Now back to Phil. He sat down with journalist Mara S. Campo in an expanded episode for Investigation Discovery's The Fall of Diddy, which aired this week. Now, watching the episode was a little eerie as many voice notes from Diddy to Phil were played for the viewers. So you can hear Diddy asking for things like chocolate for women, or to clean up, or to get a plan B, or even get him drugs like mushrooms or Cialis, which is for erectile dysfunction. Now, many of the details he shared were also echoed in his lawsuit, but we learned new details, including that Phil testified before a grand jury back in October in Diddy's case. Now, we learned from his 32-page lawsuit that Diddy allegedly instructed Phil to supply a range of drugs and sex toys for his days-long sexual escapades, and he was instructed to be a part of the cleanup crew after. Now, during his sit-down interview with Mara Escampo, Phil said, "We usually had a laundry list of items that included lights, alcohol, marijuana, ketamine, Molly. You have mushrooms on top of there, baby oil, and Astroglide are very important. Candles, incense, Apple TVs, electronics, computers, iPads. Obviously, there was, male libido supplements, stuff like that." Phil added those requests would become more frequent, and by frequent, on a daily basis. He claimed they were required to have those items frequently stocked. Now, Phil said he wasn't in the rooms when the Wild King Nights or freak-offs took place, so he said he couldn't speak to whether or not he heard those involved give consent. So who was there? Phil said it was young women who were impressionable, didn't have a lot of influence, mainly 20-somethings. He did say sometimes he would see new faces and then would never see them again. But he did recall one moment when he saw a woman physically shaking after a Wild King Night. And when she was brought to a car, she said something along the lines of, "I've never done anything like this before." So what was the aftermath of the Wild King Nights? Well, according to Phil's lawsuit, he would have to remove the drugs, the condoms, the sex toys, but also the bodily stains like blood, urine, fluids from sheets and furniture, and pack it all away. In the episode, though, he added that there would be baby oil everywhere in the tubs, on the furniture, and more. And if you're wondering where these nights recorded, according to Phil, they were, and he saw evidence of it. When asked if he saw his former boss get violent, he remembered another moment where Diddy allegedly was violent with a young woman. He said this alleged assault happened at his home in Florida, and he saw Diddy allegedly kick a young woman twice. She fell to the floor. Diddy told her to take off his hoodie, leaving the woman topless. Now, Phil said he used a jacket he was wearing to cover her up, and then she was just put in an Uber and sent home. He said that woman ended up returning after Diddy showered her with gifts. And this also echoes many of the allegations made in other lawsuits as well. Another shocking moment during Phil's time working for Diddy is that the former executive assistant allegedly was told by the mogul to prove his loyalty to him. And by proving his loyalty, it wasn't fetching his favorite meal or running an important errand for Diddy. Phil was allegedly told to prove his loyalty by having sex with someone right in front of Diddy. Now, Phil also made this claim in his lawsuit, but delved more into it in the episode where he was visibly emotional and teared up recalling this moment. He said he was grabbed by the shoulders like a coach would do to a player before a game and handed a condom. Phil alleges that Diddy pushed him to the young woman who was sitting on the couch. He said the woman signaled her consent and Phil engaged in sexual activity with her. Phil said he was reluctant to do it, but did it because of fear of retribution. He said the job eventually weared him down, and like I mentioned before, he left in 2021. 3 years before Diddy's arrest. But it might be very possible we could hear from Phil once again if he's called as a witness for Diddy's trial. Of course, Diddy's team responded to the docuseries. In a response to Phil's lawsuit, though, Diddy's legal team responded by writing, quote, "No matter how many lawsuits are filed, it won't change the fact that Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted or sex trafficked anyone, man or woman, adult or minor. We live in a world where anyone can file a lawsuit for any reason. Fortunately, a fair and impartial judicial process exists to find the truth, and Mr. Combs is confident he will prevail in court." End quote. And in response to the docu-series, his attorneys told The Hollywood Reporter, "These documentaries are rushing to cash in on the media circus surrounding Mr. Combs. The producers failed to provide sufficient times or details for his representatives to address unsubstantiated claims, many from unidentified participants whose allegations lack context. By withholding this information, they made it impossible for Mr. Combs to present facts to counter these fabricated accusations. This production is clearly intended to present a one sided and prejudicial narrative. As we said before, Mr. Combs cannot respond to every publicity stunt or facially ridiculous claim. He has full confidence in the facts and the judicial process where the truth will prevail. The accusations against him are pure fiction." So many documentaries out now about Sean Combs, aka Diddy, and with so many new documentaries, now there's new accusations, there's new allegations. But let's break down Phil's claims with criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Julie Rendelman. Julie, always so great to see you. What's your reaction to Phil Pines' claims? He says that part of his job was to clean up these wild king nights or these freak offs, as well as prove his loyalty by having sex with a woman in front of Diddy.
Anytime an individual comes forward, whether it be on a documentary or the like, and speaks out, in this case, in regards to Sean Combs, I think we always have to look at things objectively. And I say that because this is someone who has filed a lawsuit, along with many others, against Sean Combs. And so we have to recognize that there is an interest in the outcome of the case. There's a potential bias. That doesn't mean he's not telling the truth, but I think it's important for everyone when they're viewing any of these witnesses to recognize that they need to see the whole picture before assuming that it's all true.
And one point in this bonus episode, I should say, that was particularly interesting to me is that Phil revealed during this episode that he was called to testify for the grand jury back in October. What do you think that means in terms of Diddy's case going forward, especially given that he was his former personal or executive assistant for that 2-year period? And do you think that it could also mean that he'll be called to testify once trial starts in May?
Great question. So, yes, if they used him in the grand jury, it's very possible and plausible that they're going to use him to testify if and when there is a trial. One of the problems, though, that happens, Elizabeth, is when an individual continues to talk to various outlets, potentially some of the things they say may become inconsistent. With what they said before, even if it's on a slight issue. And so, if I'm the federal prosecutor, I'm not thrilled that someone's going on various outlets to talk about this case. If I'm the defense attorney, I'm loving it because I'm going to want to take every single statement they made and potentially try to use it against them if I can.
And are you surprised by kind of, I guess, the two grand jury witnesses that have been confirmed right now who have spoken out to the media? You know, we have Courtney Burgess and now we have Phil Pines. Are you surprised that grand jury witnesses are speaking to the media before a trial like this even begins?
I'm not surprised. I mean, remember, the prosecutors are going to tell these witnesses, we can't control what you do, but we would ask you. Usually, they'll say not to speak to anyone in some type of outlet, such as they've done already. For the very reason we talked about a few minutes ago, it doesn't benefit the prosecutor, as far as I'm concerned, at all, with one exception. It does throw that narrative out there for free, in a sense, for the prosecutor. So now, even though as a defense attorney, I'm liking it because I want to be able to get those inconsistent statements, there could be an argument that the prosecutor isn't hating it as long as it's consistent, because now it's kind of infecting the potential jury pool who now are hearing these things that are very anti Sean Puffy Combs.
And given that, one of the allegations made by the government is that, Combs Enterprise is kind of this racketeering conspiracy in a way, and that Diddy is the head of this organization. So, how important is Phil Pines's um, commentary, allegations, testimony, given that he did work for Diddy for those 2 years periods and could possibly be kind of a central figure given that he worked right under Christina Coram, who has been named in a lawsuit. Of course, she denies those allegations. But given that he got a firsthand witness to what Diddy was like, how he ran things, and, the voice notes about getting drugs for him and, cleaning up these wild king nights and freak offs, how important is that testimony?
So I think one of the most important things you mentioned is the audios, because I think you have to remember when the prosecutor's deciding who to use, who to believe, they want corroboration. And so they're going to say a jury doesn't just have to rely on what he says. They can even question whether or not, he has a motive in terms of wanting financial gain in the future. But the audios speak for themselves, and the audios create that corroboration that they need in order to say to jury, you can believe him because there's separate evidence that supports what he says. And by doing that, he kind of lays the groundwork. He gives you the background of what was going on behind the scenes. It might just be a piece of things, because remember, obviously he doesn't make out the entirety of the case, but it certainly gives the prosecution some of the steps they need to get to the ultimate, which is to find him guilty of the ultimate charges.
And obviously, Diddy's defense, they claim he's innocent. They deny all the allegations made in the lawsuits, all of that sort. But I think one kind of argument that the defense has been making throughout all of this case is that these acts were consensual. They were between consenting adults. But, just kind of hearing through either the lawsuits or through these documentaries, which I know you had mentioned, like possibly take it a little bit with a grain of salt there. But, in terms of all these people coming forward to say and give their piece, I know a lot of people always are kind of questioning whether or not some people are lying or possibly doing this for fame or for clout. But in terms of just the many allegations that are just pouring in, is it possible that all these people are lying? Or do you, when it comes to the defense kind of claiming that all of this was consensual, whereas other people who are bringing about these lawsuits or even making these accusations and allegations are claiming it wasn't, and this was a dangerous man?
I mean, as a prosecutor, I used to tell a jury, especially if I had one witness, that you could have 50 witnesses that come in here and you don't believe a single one. But you could have one witness that comes in and you believe them enough to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. So is it possible that everyone is lying? It's possible. It's also possible that they're telling the truth about parts of it and not telling the truth about other parts of it. I want to hone in on the area in terms of consent, because one of the things Pines talks about is the fact that some of the individuals that he encountered that had sexual encounters, he believes, with Sean Combs were younger. He didn't say they were underage, but they were younger. And he describes them as being more malleable, more willing to do things that others wouldn't. Well, consent, there's a fine line. So if an individual is potentially consenting to taking drugs, but then when they take drugs, they are not of the mental ability to consent to a sexual act, well, that's a problem for Sean Combs. So when we talk about consent, there's a gray area there, and some of that is what the federal prosecutors may potentially be focusing on to their advantage.
Right. Well, Julie Rendelman, I really appreciate your insight into this case, especially given that you were a former prosecutor, now criminal defense attorney. Before we sign you off, though, where do you think everything goes from here? We have Diddy's trial just around the corner in May.
So, I mean, I'm going to guess that it doesn't start in May. I'm always of the assumption that something's going to push it out further. Of course, I've been known to be wrong. I think the interesting thing is, one, is whether we're going to see any additional charges, because they can go back into the grand jury and indict. And I think the second thing is, who is going to be there to testify? Because I think there's a lot of unknowns. We certainly know the people that we've heard about because they've been putting themselves out, in the media stratosphere. But I think there's going to be witnesses that we're going to be talking about in the future, going like, I cannot believe that person's up there. I didn't expect that. So that's what I think is going to be interesting to see.
All right, Julie Rendelman, always appreciate your insight into our cases here. Thank you again so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Always good to see you.
And Sean Diddy Combs still at this time remains behind bars in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. He pleaded not guilty to his federal charges and denies all the accusations in the nearly 40 lawsuits he still faces. His trial is nearing, and that's set to begin on May 5th. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.